And now, if I can hand over to our next session, which is effectively dealing with the organization's corporate response to the regulatory changes and to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is going to be moderated by Derede McAlpin from Levick, which is a PR agency. So the idea behind this is that we have some companies and PR sort of looking at the issues from the other end of the telescope, from the corporate end of the telescope. So if I can hand over to Derede, and then she will introduce the fellow panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Tim. That was a great overview of cases and the current landscape. So I'm delighted to be here at the Intelligence, Compliance, and Regulations Management Virtual Symposium. In this session, we are going to focus on how organizations are responding to the ever-changing regulatory environment and also with the challenges of COVID. And just by way of background, I serve as Senior Vice President and Head of Litigation for Levick, global advisory firm based in Washington. We work around the world on all kinds of issues. My specialization is helping clients navigate the court of public opinion, along with the court of law, some of the reputational issues and crisis issues that come out of that. I am also a former member of the press, so when dealing with regulatory issues, I used to be part of that camera crew chasing people down, but now I provide advice on the other side. I'm also a lawyer by training. So now I would just like to give you just a brief overview of what we've seen at Levick from a crisis management perspective, which ties into a lot of the issues you heard earlier today. We've been seeing an uptick in cases involving C-suite executives, especially dawn raids involving multiple agencies like the DOJ, usually showing up at the homes of CEOs and executives. We've seen a lot of those cases, also investigations that are not yet public. We've seen aggressive ransomware tactics used, especially in the wake of COVID, even some bad actors that use really forward-looking techniques like working with the media or setting up customer service platforms after there is a demand through Bitcoin. So we've seen changes like that. And then, of course, in the wake of the death of George Floyd, we've also seen a lot of organizations address worldwide protests, calling for social justice, racial equity, and that has also tied into diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions in the workplace or the lack thereof, and that has created issues for everyone. So with that, I would like to take an opportunity to introduce our exceptional panel. We have on our panel today, Simona Habic. She is Integrity and Anti-Corruption Compliance Manager and Data Protection Leader with RTV SLO. She's in the space of public service broadcasting. I would also like to introduce Patrick Garcia. Patrick is a Chief Compliance and Integrity Officer with Parker Drilling. And then I would also like to introduce Renaud Jaune. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Renaud, is that right?
Jaune.
Jaune, I'm sorry. Okay, my apologies. He is a Senior Counsel, Tax, Anti-Corruption, Compliance with Baker and McKenzie. So why don't we start with the panel providing a brief overview of your work and your organizations, just so the audience can have a better idea of your work and some of your challenges. Why don't we start with Simona?
Hi, thank you for the introduction. I must say that I totally feel you are working in front of the microphone and behind the microphone. I was a journalist as well in my previous life. Well, actually, I will start with another perspective, which is implementing integrity and compliance system into the public sector, which RTV Slovenia is actually a public service broadcaster, and we are part of European Broadcasting Union, for the ones who don't know that. And that is really challenging for me to start from scratch, because regulatory, we are not obliged to have the whole program. In the coming year, we are accepting whistleblowers, of course, directive to be implemented in Slovenia. And some of the regulatory challenges also are arising in the COVID times. And at the same time, because we are not obliged to have the Intergrity program, it's sometimes difficult to implement one, especially because the shift of the culture needs much longer time. And as I was working also as a consultant for the European Commission anti-corruption report and the review part, and of course working in other environments throughout the world, I can contribute to that significantly. But at the same time, people are the ones which are a solution and at the same time a challenge.
Thank you, Sonia. And Patrick, could you provide us with an overview of your company and also some of the challenges you're seeing?
Sure, thank you so much. Well, first I want to say I'm delighted to be here and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone. My name is Pat Garcia. I work at I'm the Chief Compliance Officer of Parker Drilling. We're an international oil field service company where the operation generally is more based outside the US as opposed to in the US, where most of the revenue is generated outside the country. My background, similar to many people on the panel, I've been a prosecutor, I was at a law firm, I've been at a number of companies under a monitorship or DPA, lived in Europe working at a company named Wimpelkamp that was under a monitorship, and before that Slovenija. So I think that with the kind of different areas I've seen in terms of being at a company, Slovenija, that had 120,000 employees versus Wimpelkamp that had kind of 50,000, and where I am now, I think that the risks are pretty much the same in terms of what we're looking at and how we're addressing risk, whether it's the telecom industry or the energy industry. And I've worked with colleagues from all around the different industries, and I've traveled to about 80 countries around the world. And one of the things that I think, right now and how we're addressing risk at Parker Drilling is we are really in a tough market right now with COVID, with the drop in demand. But I think what we've seen is just what at least from the board perspective, our board has seen that in all boards across the country, that companies are still able to roll up their numbers, they're still able to be productive, and they're still able to get work done. But just as any company that you're with, you have your normal challenges, and we're addressing it through supplementing where we can, relying on technology, relying on more automation. We've sort of accelerated a lot of things we had in the queue that we were working on before. We've pulled a lot of projects forward. And so I think what's helpful at my company is that because I was here about 10 years ago and we had an FCPA settlement, and we had a settlement with the Crown Office, with the Scottish Civil Recovery Unit years ago. They understand, the UKBA, they understand the FCPA, so that's really helpful. The issue is more the resource, fighting for resources. Everybody has insatiable wants, but there's only a finite amount of resources. There's only so much money in the company. And so that's been how we've been dealing with the challenges, trying to leverage what we can with technology and with other lawyers that we have that are already based overseas, and trying to kind of bring them in and get everyone trained up so that we could deal with these challenges and obstacles with respect to not being able to get on the plane and go out and fly to Kazakhstan or anywhere else. But that's just sort of the general overview of the company and kind of what we're doing writ large with the rest of the world.
Thanks, Pat. And I'm going to be circling back with you just to learn more about some of the ways you also leverage technology. Renaud, I would like to also provide you with an opportunity to talk about your company and background, and then some of the challenges you're seeing on the horizon.
Yes, thank you.
With your organization.
Thank you, Derede. I'm with Baker McKenzie here in Paris. I deal with tax and also with compliance within the compliance investigation group that Baker has. But this is a recent experience. I just arrived actually in September. Before that, I was with the French Anticorruption Agency. I was heading the consulting program and also the international department. So my job there was to promote anti-corruption program. That means a prevention, since it was important for us to help explain the new legislation, SAPN 2, which was mentioned during the first panel, and the fact that now companies in France and also administrations are submitted to a capacity of control by an agency, a regulation agency that deals with prevention programs regarding corruption. So there we of course built a structure of guidelines in order to help the actors appropriate these stakes. We also built a network of relationships with regulation authorities in France, dealing with data, dealing with financial, or dealing with competition aspects of regulation. We also built a relationship with prosecutors, of course, which was critical when dealing with huge cases that were mentioned during the panel. I think everybody here understands which cases I'm referring to. And also we built an international network in order to gather the best practices, because that's what the goal of SAPN 2 was, to bring France into the highest standard regarding the fight against corruption.
Thanks, Renaud. And we will be circling back just to get some deeper insight. I'd like to shift to Simona. I would actually like to ask my favorite question of all, especially I'm in the crisis space. So it's my go-to question when dealing with challenges. And it's like, what keeps you up at night, especially, in the public service broadcasting space? What have been your biggest challenges, and what keeps you up at night? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. If I can make a joke, my husband keeps me awake at night. I'm kidding. Well, actually, the excitement in the COVID times was that COVID is an opportunity for me, for compliance function, and of course for data protection, which sounds a little bit crazy, right? Or unusual, but actually I found it as a really good provider of moving forward. At the same time, the challenge was that there has been more friction because everything was new. The situation was like from today to tomorrow, and at the same time, we knew what was going to happen in the few months, of course. But at the same time, I think the most important part was that even the frictions were arising, the solutions were coming much faster. So I saw COVID as an opportunity. At the same time, regulation is changing so fast in line of dealing with employees, health issues, temperature, which my company wanted to measure to each employee or visitors, because we have a lot of people circling around because we are media, right? So we had these kind of small issues, but at the same time, they were big. Working from home, IT compliance, trying to change the business processes, everything was there at the same time, all of the challenges. So I found those frictions in solving solutions really good, and it helped us to get to the solutions faster. That was a takeaway. And what I have developed was trust with the business leaders and with management. And now during the COVID, that was the most important part for the compliance function, so that you have trust. So when the crisis arises, there is no doubt whether your GD is going to listen to you or not. If you have good arguments, because you're working online, the communication is different. You can't see everybody in the same room at the same time. It's different when you, as your colleague said earlier, when you communicate online, it's really different. You can't feel the person. You can't use the friction to be effective more as you were before when you had personal encounters and personal communication. So I think that was the biggest challenge, but at the same time, I saw it as an opportunity. So frictions which allow us to grow faster, and at the same time, the issues in the public sector, which I can address to our public procurement in the time of COVID, which brings us also greater or in-depth corruption risks, which are, for me and from my perspective, is that public sector was shocked a little bit, like they were not prepared. It was like the misuse of public funds was there, and because of everybody was panicking, there were some of the decisions that were taken in the public procurement sector were like unusually fast and unusually sort of bypassed all of the red flagging, risk management, and all of the solutions that were already there when the usual public procurement is ongoing. So these are like a wrap up of challenges and solutions. And of course, I think that COVID is a really good time for investing in people. Even the financial situations of companies are not as good as it could be, or in the future is going to be like firing people is going to be something normal. But I think that investing in the compliance function now is something that companies need to do. Why? Because now the guidance, the leadership just recognize, oh, the compliance function is really important because it serves us, and it can give us answers to our questions really quickly. And of course, the challenge would be also training people for me, because I'm a data lead and we do a lot of data protection right now, but it is a quiet time in a way to go forward with risk assessment, policy reviews, and of course, trying to communicate with people. So trust, good communication, and not to hurry in the decision-making process because of the regulations are changing so fast. We can still wait a little bit with the decisions in this COVID time.
So I have a follow-up question, especially since you're in the space of public broadcasting, and as companies either look for ways to keep their workforce safe, or they have people working from home. One unique issue that has come up, it's probably not that unique, but for when you're looking at production or other issues where you really can't work remotely, and there's either constant COVID testing. So have you experienced this issue? And if so, how has your organization addressed it?
Well, basically our organization was, I was really surprised, really good prepared for that. Basically, we had sort of a weekly exchange of teams. We had to follow up the regulation, of course, how to organize work. But for example, from my perspective, radio was much more organized than television, because they can work solo, or an individual is preparing the radio production and radio packages by themselves. So it's easier to work from home or to isolate themselves, but it's really difficult with television teams. And of course, we circulate outside, we come into the company, we go outside, we interview people, people come to the radio and television shows, and we manage that going outside in the summer. So basically from May to August, all of the important, also anti-corruption radio broadcasts, which anti-corruption on the public procurement misuse, of course, radio broadcasts were taken outside in front of our TV. So we managed to organize work really effectively. What we had issues is with the data protection during COVID, because the fluctuation of people is really high, and we are not able to measure temperature to people because this is unconstitutional in a way. and it goes into the integrity of a person. So it cannot be measured against the public interest or the interest of the company, even if it's for the health reasons, because our legislation is also really strict. So basically the medical, so in-house medical doctor, which is actually official medical doctor, needs to confirm that this is really a needed measure. And this is where we have arguments also with works councils, etc. But we try to manage this in a really good communication way. So basically all of the stakeholders, internal and external, need to cooperate. But at the same time, Slovenian government is really changing the regulation really fast, and it's really difficult to comply. But at the same time, with a solid basis. So basically we know what we have to do. And our purpose is to serve the public with news. They need to be there. And we managed to organize work properly in a way that we have teams. But for example, one compliance problem was that if one person comes in without a mask, it can affect the whole production. So the measures need to be respected. And I think that people do that. In general, that works. And we managed to have almost 0 infections by the last month, but in Slovenia the infections are now really on a high scale, so we can't avoid it. But with a really good organization of work, we managed to also manage this sort of compliance risks.
Yeah, it's I guess a huge challenge, but it looks like you're doing all of the proactive things to address it, especially having the doctor on site. So that's a very interesting.
Yeah, but we have a collision of interest, because the doctor says you don't need to measure temperature, which I agree with, because it was also by the research of the European Commission defined as non-effective for different reasons. I don't want to go there because it's too long. But actually there was people were measuring temperatures of travelers on airports, and it was not effective. And of course also the measure machines are actually, the difference between calibrations are so high that you can't discriminate people not to come to work if somebody is pregnant that has a little bit of a recent temperature, or if somebody has, for example, I don't know, higher temperature because he ran to work. So those things needs to be considered, and temperature is not the main factor, because somebody can, be infected but not having any symptoms. So we try to manage it with soft approach, but at the same time, as you know, journalists are really special personalities, so it's sometimes really challenging to deal with. If I can be direct, with egos, I was a journalist as well, so with people who are difficult to move to something, like you have to be compliant, you can't accept gifts, or you have to do this, and they're like, okay, what is she talking about? So this for me is what keeps me going, not keeps me up at night, but keeps me going. Because if I can introduce compliance and integrity and ethics in a way that it affects their personal life, like online protection when you work from home, like Wi-Fi protection, through their personal dilemmas or personal life, that works. So basically, I think this is a takeaway, like respect people and use frictions, or not conflicts, frictions, for building up new solutions.
And to your point about masks, we're having a slight problem with masks in the United States, since the leadership in our country doesn't want to wear one. So we can certainly relate to the ego factor and that challenge. I'd like to shift over to Pat. Tell the audience, what keeps you up at night, and what are some of the biggest challenges you are addressing?
Yeah, well, there's keeping me up at night. I try to do my best to sleep well when I can, but there's always, the way I look at it, you have your ongoing challenges, and then what COVID's brought. And I think a lot of people are focused on, well, we'll get a vaccine by the end of the year, maybe by the second half of the year, things will normalize and stabilize. But I think that, over the long run, whether if you look back the swine flu, every few years, there's some kind of virus that comes out. And it wouldn't surprise me if we sort of retract back in a few years into some other crisis, because you just can't predict things. So I think trying to learn how to be effective in this environment is really helpful. The existing risks that have always been there, the challenges that I would say is, with the rise in data protection, trying to do due diligence on a mass scale when you run into sort of data privacy regulations that are different. Within the United States, you have differences in California versus other states. You go to Russia, you have to save documents, you have to save things to the local server first. I mean, there's all these different challenges when you're going to investigate someone. In some jurisdictions, you have to notify them. Or I've been to Uzbekistan, and I don't even think they know what their data privacy regulations are. So, I mean, that's sort of your ongoing challenges you have. You have your ongoing challenges with cybersecurity, with reciprocal sanctions, me going back and forth to Ukraine, and they have their own sanctions with Russia and things like that. But I think what COVID has brought to this is, and I've heard already people kind of talk about the challenges of doing investigations on via remote video, and you have someone just drops suddenly and says, "Oh, it's my internet." It's pretty convenient, and so you deal with those. But it's also the supply chain. There's been a disruption in supply chain, and how it's not suboptimal right now, and having to suddenly engage new suppliers, new vendors to try to meet these supply chain challenges can be quite a challenge in itself. And then you have, with what's going on with the economy, especially in the industry I'm in, you've had sort of widespread reductions in capital spending. You've had people get pay cuts. You've had layoffs. You've had people been made redundant. And so, what generally happens is that sometimes there's some resentment in the people that are left. Sometimes, with these travel restrictions, you can't go out to Indonesia or other countries where if you're not watching or you're not present, if you're not in India or you're not going to Iraq, it's hard to get a good assessment of what's going on. I think we've seen challenges in relatedly how to do a risk assessment where, there's no one size fits all. Every company does it differently. Some companies are well ahead with automation. Some companies do a mix of going on the ground. I particularly like getting on the ground, but we've had to sort of change the process for doing that because we can't get out. Even if you can, you're going to be quarantined. So it's just how to react rapidly when you have all these different obstacles. That's sort of what keeps me up at night, and not being able to know what's happening on the ground, because I could have a phone call, but that really is not as effective as being in person, getting to know the local operation, getting a good sense of the people on the ground. And I think that's why you want to make sure you look at compliance, not just from the corporate compliance, like the headquarters. You really have to cascade that out to the mid-level management, the non-compliance personnel, the non-lawyers, because when these leaders have their town halls, they're remotely, when they're on the ground in Dubai or wherever they're stationed, people are going to take cue from how their leader operates. And, they're going to expect compliance to tell you to follow A, B, and C. But when they hear that from their own business, and when they hear that it's important and that message is cascaded down, I think that's fundamentally essential. When I look at how we think about resources, I don't think it's like the way it was in the past where people have evaluated, well, tell me how many compliance personnel you have. I think it's tell me what you're doing in the areas you see risk and how you're augmenting or supplementing where you don't have personnel because there's just been massive layoffs happening right now. And what are you doing to address that? And I think you have to be a little bit more narrow, focused, and targeted on where you're going to allocate your resources to deal with some of these risks. So that's sort of what keeps me up at night, but how I'm able to sleep, because as someone in compliance, it's hard to sleep if you think too deeply about it. Got to do meditation.
That's true. Renaud, what keeps you up at night?
I have a 4-month-old baby at home, and so but apart from that, there is there is a sense that there is kind of a triangle of impossibilities right now, because we know that, and when I was in AFA, we tried to organize that the activity of the regulation authorities and prosecutors go on. At the same time, there is a sense in the companies that emergency should, and the quick capacity of response to the crisis should lead to sometimes take some liberty with the programs they have, or if they have a program already. And there is a risk of being prosecuted, and also a risk of reputation, because sometimes when you don't audit perfectly your supply chain, etc., there might be risks regarding modern slavery, etc. And so this is a moment that appears as something very concerning for the companies we tend to deal with, because they feel they have to enter all kinds of stakes at the same moment, which may not be entirely convergent together. That is really something, building a quick capacity for companies, or help them. What we've tried to develop, for example, in the firm here, is a very quick gap analysis that helps companies in, let's say, 10 days, be able to know what kind of risks they have on a legal and reputational standpoint, and help them try and prioritize things to face the current situation.
And in addition to a gap analysis, what are some of the other ways you're addressing some of these challenges?
Probably everybody has read about this note that was published in recently by the American, it's OFAC, the American administrations dealing with foreign assets. People have to face, there's been an explosion. I read somewhere something like 40% of raise in the risks of ransomware right now. So we have companies facing major risks, and at the same moment, regulation authorities telling them do not pay in these cases, because not only can you face operational or financial risks, not only will you have very limited capacity to regain your data if you pay, but also you may face American sanctions due to the fact that the person who try and blackmail you is maybe someone that is established in a state under embargo or as the analyst. And I see you have to provide with very quick answers to people dealing with blocking statute. I don't know if everyone is familiar with this kind of statutes. We have that in France. It means that you are not supposed to cooperate directly with OFAC or with the DOJ. You have first to contact the French administration, and bringing this quick legal capacity of response to people is really something that is critical for them in a context that is obviously quite bringing a lot of anxiety for people we deal with.
And yeah, you raise a great transition point for us to, we've been throughout the day, looking at some of the past issues and regulatory challenges, but there are new risks on the horizon: vaccine litigation, class action suits. Pat, could you address some of the new risks that you either anticipate or some that your organization is currently addressing?
Yeah, I think that when we obviously we sort of have these kind of buckets that we look at, where you have anti-money laundering, you have sanctions, you have these different areas. But I know that in the U.S. we're changing administrations, and I've heard that the DOJ said they don't really anticipate a change in how they're doing business. But I do think it's not unreasonable to think that in the world of sanctions and export controls, how we deal with Iran, these other countries, there could be a shift. And we have to, and that's tough, because we always have to readjust quickly in terms of the world of sanctions, because you have the EU sanctions, what I think Renaud mentioned, which covers certain areas. You have the Annex 2, and then you have the US OFAC sanctions. You have OFAC issuing some guidance, very similar to the DOJ's guidance with respect to a corporate compliance program. A lot of the programmatic elements are the same. And then, so you're putting all this together, and you throw out the cyber risk and where we see a lot more cyber espionage, a lot more companies trying to get information. I think as we go forward, you're going to see also a big push for ESG, environmental social governance, where there's a lot more regulatory focus on modern slavery. Renaud mentioned human rights, child labor, and sometimes I get feedback from colleagues, and they say, well, the DOJ has the toughest bite here. And so I think that's wrong to not focus on, because if you're a compliance department, you're trying to portray that your job is to do the right thing. Your job is to try to operate ethically. So, if you're not focusing on hiring somewhere and some supplier, and it looks like there's some things that are strange in how they procure items, what they use and how they do business, maybe it's not an FCPA concern, but it still is a concern. And all those things have to be addressed, because that's sort of the challenge that I think that we're seeing, is how to address all these things. I do think that compliance departments do need to get quicker and faster when it comes to technology. You see the rollout of 5G and software applications running on top of 5G, and companies going to the edge a little bit more. And so how do we quickly adapt to be able to keep up with that technology? Because the employees are demanding more, they're demanding faster, they're demanding quicker. They're saying, we'll do whatever you tell me, but please, work with us here, because we don't have as many people now to help out. So I'll do anything you ask, whether it's looking at entertainment, travel, gifts, whether it's due diligence, what do you need me to do? But at the same time, you lose a lot of credibility if you're not able to run your department and your program efficiently across the enterprise. So that's sort of what I see in the future and where I think we're going. But I am positive in the fact that I think that what COVID does, and it's every time you have a downturn, there's a liquidity crisis, meaning there's a cash crisis. Companies take cash out, they have to preserve cash in order to sustain. And so what generally happens is that you start looking at what personnel are essential, and you start figuring out better ways to do things. And so I think we're going to come out of this with a lot of efficiencies in how we do things. The ban on travel has been tough. There's no way to get around that. But I think there's other things that we can look at, and maybe we keep after COVID, and we keep operating that way to make sure that we are operational and responsive to the business, because we are a business in how we do things.
Thanks, Pat. I know that we're almost at the end of our program. I just wanted to allow Simona to just quickly touch on some of the new risks you see, but also, what people need to know, when we look ahead in the next 12 to 18 months. Simona?
Oh,
yeah.
Yes. I think for the media and for the public sector, it's so the media is changing significantly, and misuse of information, fake news, and for example, corruption of information is something that we need to worry about. It doesn't have to be in relation with COVID or not. I think that the look forward would be to understand that frictions are good, and the crisis situation brings us forward, as Pat said, to find solutions. So we are sort of forced to find solutions more effectively in a short time. And in the future, what I would expect and what I would like to see is that public sector also introduces not just obligatory integrity and anti-corruption programs, but sees that as an opportunity as well, and risk assessments as an opportunity to be a better public service to people, because we are there because of them, right? And I see also the development of compliance function in the public sector as one of the key pillars of changing the organizational culture. And the role of the compliance officer is to be communicative, to use the knowledge, jokes, and of course the everyday situations to change that culture. And it takes 10 to 20 years, I think, sort of in the public sector at least. I don't know how is it in companies, but maybe it's faster because of the regulation requirements. But that would be a takeaway, like talk to people and use your everyday situations, like use children. People are really sensitive to children, and they're sensitive and their data protection, for example, and they're sensitive to their money. So how to provide protection for your bank cards, and then why is it important to lock your computer or work at home with a compliant environment. So I think these small steps are bringing compliance function to the next level also in the public sector.
Thanks, Simona. Renaud, you are a former prosecutor, and we've heard from regulators earlier today. So, as far as takeaways and what we're looking at as we end the year and look at the future, what are you seeing, and what does the audience need to know?
I think three things are important. The first one is that you have to think. And Pat mentioned that compliance should be built with the other key functions in the company. Outside from the period of emergency, it's important to build a network together with audit, with operational services, with legal as well, in order to build a constant knowledge. Environment is moving quite fast, and it's important to have compliance officers helping structuring, because it's important for the management, who may sometimes not be conscious enough of the risks, but helping them to bring more knowledge about this. It's definitely a good way of building. The second thing is keep in mind the cross-border environment, because legislations evolve a lot right now. You have a draft statutes in Germany regarding criminal liability. You have whistleblowing processes that evolve after the recent directive. There is no, it's a play on word with the American elections, there is no flyover state regarding compliance. You have to follow up with what's happening everywhere. And the third thing is, since it's also a question of reputation that is growing, because the public opinions don't want right now to have misconducts, because the context is such. You have to deal with the extended enterprise. It's very important to deal with third parties, and to also deal with public relations, and to be consistent when dealing with public relations. Too often, and I'm going to end up with that, too often when you read reports by companies, you can see that there are efforts made to have a universal registration document that is great, that is perfectly shaped communication-wise. But when you read that in the details, you can see there are inconsistencies between, let's say, corporate governance, between anti-corruption. All these things are things that look and that people look at and that show. It's very easy when you have an exercised eye to look at the gaps that people have between how they communicate and what they do actually on things. So take that into account, that reputation is not just a matter of communicating, it's also a matter of doing first.
Thank you. You've raised a really great point. We've seen that issue come up in the communication space. Well, I would like to thank our great panel. You've offered a great lineup of takeaways and also good points as far as COVID and the regulatory environment creating opportunity for companies to shift or prepare is one of the key things. We provide from the crisis management space, and that's to use your peacetime wisely and to prepare and monitor. And with that point, I would like to thank all of you for your great insights, and I would like to kick it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Derede. That was absolutely outstanding. Just one thing, actually, that I wanted to pick up with possibly Renaud, first of all, would be one of the questions that was asked earlier by Sundar on the line was, do you think that as a result of COVID, there's going to be a governmental focus on the healthcare sector and those that are defrauding government and defrauding public monies, picking up on something that Simona was saying, because of the amount of public money that has been given to companies to help them stay afloat? If there's serious frauds on them, do you think that's likely to be an area of focus with the French authorities? Do you think it's likely to be an area of focus in the US? Certainly speaking from a UK side, I can definitely see that being the case. And I'm sure Pat would be glad to hear if that is the case, because it might move the focus away, the eye of Sauron, move away from the oil and gas industry and move on to another sector. But what's your thoughts on that, Renaud?
Of course, it's a general idea. I have no insight of what the regulators are going to do now, but what is sure is that it would be very tempting if you have targets regarding tax audits or regarding sanctions, and some countries we know have that, of course. If you have that kind of targets, it's tempting to move to the sectors that haven't faced the crisis in the same way as the others. That's for now. That's for the coming year. For the years afterwards, as you said, it's also probable, and as for France, I would say quite certain that all the companies, all the sectors that will have received a lot of public expenditures are going to be audited in order to make sure that the use has been made according to the help, and that they have been exemplary in the way of dealing with ethics, compliance, and all the economic objectives. Of course.
Yeah, certainly on the UK side, there is a big focus on COVID frauds, and I'm part of a cross-government and private sector watch group that is putting out details about frauds that you need to keep an eye out on.
Have you seen that, for example, the last G7 announced a new cooperation between the Ministries of Finance in order to track ransomware activities. So in addition to what you said, that there is of course let's say COVID-oriented audits or prosecutions, there are going to be audit-oriented cooperation between the prosecuting and regulation authorities.
And we've certainly had some enforcement in the UK in relation to some of these loans and the furlough schemes and frauds being partaken on them. And I see Patricia Bailey's just mentioned her comments in relation to activities going on in France. But Pat, just from your side on the corporate perspective, because you've had the gaze on your industry and obviously the telecoms industry when you were working beforehand with Veon/Vimpelcom on you, so you're well versed in how to try and stay clear of trouble and what sort of measures should be put in place. What do you think the audience should be looking at to really protect themselves and keep themselves as safe as possible?
Yeah, well, before I get into that, I think that I want to agree with what you said, Patrick, about sort of the shift in what generally happens. Because if you look historically in the US, for instance, let's just take the housing crisis. You saw a lot of mortgage fraud, and you saw some prosecutions follow. You saw some task force formed, and so generally, with the U.S. at least, just looking at taking main justice outside, you have a lot of independent jurisdictions with U.S. attorneys' offices. Then you have state assistant district attorneys going after certain cases, and so sometimes it wouldn't be unreasonable to anticipate some targeted look at some of these industries, companies, individuals receiving it. And I know that we've had stalls on the stimulus, but I think if there's another big stimulus package out, they're going to have all eyes on how that's distributed, because we've seen a lot of abuse just on the last stimulus from folks. In terms of risk, I think that it's the risk is really what I've seen when you're in a company that's in trouble. it's easy to get resources. It's easy to talk about compliance. It's easy for everyone to come together because they have you're either self-reporting or you have a monitor. There's all these different reasons. Whether it's an OFAC fine like we had at the last company I was at, where we had a $300 million OFAC fine, which is with Slovenija, or at VimpelCom, where we had 795 million FCPA fine. But I think what the key is those things don't last forever. So you really have to institutionalize compliance into the culture. And so I think how you deal with these risks, or obviously you could have your programmatic areas, all the elements of an effective compliance program, policies, procedures, trainings, risk assessments, and all those things are certainly they need to stand. But unless it's embedded in the culture of the company, because culture sort of eats strategy for lunch, as the saying goes, and unless you have that culture, you could deal with these problems in ways. I think someone before we started said that someone asked if being on a panel they had to go through due diligence. Now, sometimes people say, well, whoa, I get tired of all these questions because that's not a third-party agent. But when you have people coming and speaking up because they're thinking about it, then you have a successful compliance program, because people are thinking about it in their mind. Even if they're wrong, you never want to shut anyone down for asking a good question. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. No, we're okay. But that's what you have to do. And certainly, I think you continue to evaluate where you have risk, evaluate what you need to do, evaluate how you evolve, how you stay relevant, it's a fight for resources. Because I've been in a room where someone will say, yeah, you keep talking about the DOJ and their program. What about me? I haven't, if we get it wrong, there's a huge environmental spill. There's all these different groups out there that are trying to do the right thing based on what their functional area is. So you really have to bring everyone together for a good understanding to work in a corporation where there's shared values. And that's when you achieve success in a company.
When you've got limited resources, just sort of following up from that, and then I'll just ask Simona to comment as well from a public service side of things. When you've got limited resources, unlike the banks, which might have teams of, particularly after the global financial crisis, 400 odd compliance officers, whereas you and a handful of others in considerably smaller teams. How do you instill that sort of speak up culture? How do you get sufficient resources? How do you persuade people when you're not directly under the microscope of the regulators?
Right. So that's a pretty, so you're right. So the banks, and I've done AML for mobile digital financial services. And so, when we looked at banks, it's sort of, you have these AML requirements. You have to have compliance officers. You look at JP Morgan, you look at Citi, they're sort of embedded. They're there. But when it's not mandated, how do you do that? And that really starts with what's your relationship with the board, with the audit committee? Where's the CEO sit? Where's the general counsel? It has to be at the top, but then it also has to be, you have to get a culture where it's coming from the bottom. And so how you do that is, I remember years ago, I did a training at a company, my first training, and someone raised their hand and said, look, I was at Weatherford. We had an FCPA fund. I've been trained on the FCPA so many times. How long is this training going to last? Your first question when you're getting ready to speak and someone's shooting you down before you even, get a talk, because they're already watching their clock. So you have a little fatigue there. And so you have to make it relevant to everyone to try to see how they're important. And I know that's a little bit more difficult when you have larger, the last one we had 25,000 employees in Russia. So we had to, how do we kind of cascade that out? But for instance, the finance function, they're a part of the ecosystem. Supply chain, they're checking on suppliers. The sales agents, you have to bring them in, and you have to really partner with the business, because you can't become, and I know that everyone likes to have this kind of police officer approach where they come in and it's a lot of fun to go in and kick down the door and just kind of, no one's going to give you any credibility if you operate like that. And you have to really find a way to collaborate, and that's how you build it out. You have to build it out from the bottom all the way up throughout the organization. And that's how you kind of embed that. And that's how you fight for resources, by explaining that, recognizing that everybody else's function is important. IT needs resources. I had a guy that's telling me his wife's about to divorce him because he's spending all his time on all these automation projects because of COVID. And he's really stressed. And he's like, can you please just hold on your project? I know the DOJ wants it, but can you hold? And so you have to really build relationships, because everybody is valued and not everybody's criminal. And that's why I'm pleased to hear that the DOJ will focus on more individual prosecutions, because there's a lot of people at companies that are sitting through traffic every day, getting in the train, riding the queue, just going to work, and they're getting punished because of a few bad actors. So I think that, and that's another hard sell, where I've been in trainings where people say, you got this person who sits overseas somewhere that we never even met, and they've done something wrong, and we're all having to deal with this. And so you really have to make it important for everyone. You have to recognize everyone and respect everyone as an individual, and every function as important, not be sort of arrogant in how you do things. And that's how you're able to cascade that out and get the resources you need without scaring people and saying, the DOJ says it right here in this evaluation of a, because that's not going to fly in a real operation unless you're under a DPA.
And Simona, from a sort of government entity side, and sort of in your experience of bodies that the TIs of this world and so on, what sort of takeaways would you give to the audience in terms of what you as a government body would be looking to see in a good actor that was coming forward and was using their best efforts to get business from you? What's the sort of takeaways that you'd give?
Well, actually, I'm not a part of the government. We are just a part of the public sector per se as media. But I would just join up the Pat's comments. Well, I drink a lot of coffee, actually. That means that I'm staying in touch with, I have one as well, but this is like a virtual coffee. I think the most important thing that also Pat has mentioned today was in situ coffee. That means that I come into IT department and I sit down like relaxing, and I said, oh, hi guys, what's up? It sounds strange, but then it comes bursting out of them. So, oh, somebody is listening to us. Oh, there's a change on the door. So Simona came in. Oh, some of them would say like, oh, just get rid of her. But at the same time, you need to wear different hats when you're talking to the management. Or sometimes, put the sign of, this is the regulatory requirement, you're gonna get fined, blah, blah. But you need to talk the right language to the right people. So when I come to IT department, I just sit down. Oh, would you like to have a coffee or two? And then we talk, and they just burst out with all of the ideas, what's wrong and what should be better. And they actually have really good ideas because they want things to work. And I'm just joining Pat with that. Communication, relationships, this is the most important thing. And as you mentioned, training, I was so surprised. We had an information bridge, and it's like 140 people included in it, and it was like an obligatory training, but there were like almost 160 people came because they've heard that Simona is funny, and Simona uses really interesting approach in training. So it's from practice. It's not just about, she doesn't talk about GDPR as such. She doesn't talk about this, but she's using real life. And then they are coming back to you. So that's for me a rewarding thing. And this is what I would also emphasize, as Pat said, communication, relationship from bottom to top. And again, changing the hat to keep trust with leadership and management, to send the right messages from the top. So train managers. I have every Thursday, not now during the COVID, but before I had 10 to 30 minutes of training for my GD. It was one-on-one, and I just said like, okay, you can take the olive oil, but you can't take the pumpkin oil. And he was like, what? And I was trying to explain, because if I say you can take 24.30 euros of blah, blah, but you can't do that, and then you have to report that, this is too complicated for the manager. He just needs to know, okay, what should I do and what should I tell people to do? So the key message, he is always on my training. So he comes there, greets people and says, oh, I did that and I didn't know that I shouldn't have done that. And now Simona has told me that I cannot do that and I'm not going to do that anymore. So please listen to her. I'm saved, etc. So the different relationships and the support from the tone from the top, but also train them how to send messages from the top. This is the most important thing from both sides. This is from my perspective. And there are good practices also in the public sector. If I come back for example, with the use of IT, I think that forensics, IT forensics, and the use of IT to search for connections, relations among companies, among people, are really useful tool for better sightseeing of corruption risks. For example, Slovenian anti-corruption agency's application was awarded by UN as being one of the best, and it's actually includes all of the public transactions. And based on that, the Institute of Jožef Stefan has already, and it is building up new technologies for discovering corruption risks, and at the same time actually identifying people and companies who are not just risky ones, but actually included in fraud. So IT is something that we need to invest in, and of course also as a country, I mean, also include that in the prosecution and the investigation of the anti-corruption agencies, and do use media. As a person coming from the media, we discovered a huge COVID case, misuse of public procurement in Slovenia, and our reputation is at risk because of that. So we need independent institutions protecting also whistleblowers, media, and of course, independent other institutions dealing with corruption.
Well, that's fantastic insights there from you, Simona, and thank you everybody for taking part. It's been incredibly interesting from many different perspectives. We've massively overrun in terms of your session, but I thought I'd let it go on, as it was one, we ate into it already beforehand with the earlier sessions, and secondly, it was incredibly entertaining and very knowledgeable. Thank you. So.